Hi, welcome back. My name is Eileen Chevalier and I created the typewriter alphabet, and we are looking at some botany topics. Today we're going to study some deciduous and evergreen plants. The landscape in winter can look very different from the landscape in spring, especially in cold and temperate climates. Why? In this lesson, we'll look at the differences and similarities between deciduous and evergreen plants. So, obviously, you're going to want your cards today. We're going to look at F and G. So F is our forsythia, and G is gardenia. Both of those are perennial plants. Sorry. They live for many, many years, and they don't bloom their first year like a lot of annuals. All annuals have to bloom their first year because they only have 1 year. But these plants will stay, especially here in North Carolina, and get really huge over time. But they look really different in the winter and in the summer. Like in the summer, they're both, lots of leaves, and the forsythia actually in the summer doesn't have any flowers. And then in the winter, the gardenia looks very much the same. It didn't lose any of its leaves, and the forsythia did. Forsythia is just a bunch of bare branches. But then early late winter, early spring, the gardenia still just looks green without its leaves. But the forsythia on those branches that have no leaves, or maybe some leaves sprouting at the top, as you can see in this picture, but mostly there are no leaves along the branch, flowers. And so they're such a cool branch, because instead of having its leaves, it flowers first. And so you get these branches that are just covered in yellow flowers, which would never happen with an evergreen plant because they keep their leaves, so you never get to see the branch just covered in flowers without any leaves. So they're pretty different, even though they are both perennial plants. So let's start with F, and I'll read to you. Not the whole card, but I'll just read you the main information. There are flowers, but no leaves along the branches of this forsythia. Why? In the fall, the forsythia loses all its leaves, and the flowers bloom in the spring before the leaves come back. Plants that lose their leaves are called deciduous. Then we have the G, gardenia, which is probably my favorite flower of all. Gardenia shrubs keep their leaves all year long, so they're always green. They are called evergreen plants. So they bloom in the summer, they bloom multiple times depending on the variety. So you can get them that bloom over a long period of time. You can get them that bloom in the spring and in the fall. You can get them that bloom in the summer. It's different when they're blooming, just depending on which variety you have. But they always have leaves on them. So today you're going to need a couple other books. We're going to look at Grow Your Soil, one of my favorite, most amazing books, and D.K. Smithsonian Flora. All right, before we get into those, I will read a couple of definitions for you. You probably already know them since we just talked about them, but get out your paper and write it down. It'll help you remember. First off, deciduous. Plants that lose all of their leaves annually. Evergreen. Plants that retain leaves throughout the year. All right, so our first question is a leaf. So on an evergreen plant, so if we're thinking about our gardenia, the leaf of a gardenia, is that an evergreen leaf? Or is the plant evergreen? So the gardenia plant is an evergreen plant, but not necessarily the single leaf of an evergreen. How can you find out? Look at the base of evergreen plants to see if there are any leaves there. This is a really great one in North Carolina, is magnolia trees. So they have leaves all year long. But if you look at the base of a magnolia or pine trees, think about pine trees. So they're always green, right? They always have their pine needles on them. Those are their leaves. But then, especially during certain times of year, or maybe if we're getting a drought or something, you look on the ground and what is there? What is covering the ground beneath these trees are pine needles, dead brown pine needles. Are the leaves that dropped green, or did they turn color before they dropped? So when you see, and you can actually see that like in pine trees, it's really easy because you can see that there'll be all these green pine needles, and then you'll see the brown pine needles even up in the tree before they drop. So pay attention to the colors and how dry or moist they are. Like, anyway, sometimes they're still green when they drop, depending on what's happening with the weather. Sometimes they've already turned brown and then they drop. And sometimes you can see them like turning yellow on the actual plant. So look around at some evergreen plants and see if you can see that happening as well. Why did the leaves drop? So they're evergreen plants, right? So why are they dropping leaves? What happens to a leaf that can't do its job of photosynthesizing? Why can't some leaves photosynthesize? So we know that with deciduous trees, because if you've looked at the leaves lesson, you know that, or if you've just paid attention in the fall, if you live somewhere with deciduous trees and they turn color and then they fall because it's not worth it for the tree to keep holding onto these leaves that aren't able to photosynthesize. Like even just all of the chlorophyll and the chloroplasts die because they don't have sunlight. And so that's what makes them turn yellow. And then the tree is like, sorry, you're not helping us anymore. We can't keep feeding you. So they drop their leaves. Is that same thing also happening in evergreens, except that it's not getting rid of all of its leaves. It's only getting rid of the ones that are no longer helping the plant more than they're taking energy from the plant. And why wouldn't they be able to photosynthesize? So look, if you can find an evergreen plant that has some leaves that are turning yellow, where on the plant are they? Or perhaps some of them were damaged, like perhaps someone was climbing the tree and they broke a branch, or they snapped off some of the leaves, or an animal came by and ate or otherwise damaged some leaves. Like, what is happening to those leaves and where on the plant are they? Are they on the outsides where the sun is, or are they on the inside where they're getting blocked? The sun is getting blocked by all of the other leaves. Next up, can leaves nourish a plant after they fall? Okay, so here we go. We've got a tree and it had all these beautiful leaves, and then I was like, I can't sustain you anymore, so I'm gonna stop feeding you, and then you're gonna drop off. You're gonna get dry because I'm gonna stop giving you fluids, and you're gonna get dry and you're gonna fall to the ground. Now, when the leaf was on the tree, it was photosynthesizing and feeding the plant sugar, right? So that's how the plant was able to live and survive, was because it was feeding the plant. But now it's dropped off and it's laying on the ground. Is there anything else? Is it over? That's it? The leaf has no more value? Or is the leaf still very valuable to the plant? Well, that's what we need to know. Find a plant with decaying leaves at its base and push away the leaves to see what's happening. How would the soil be different if the leaves weren't there? What does a plant need, right? So it needs the photosynthesis, but it needs lots of other things too. What are those other things that plants need to live? How do decaying leaves help the plant obtain water and nutrients? Read Diane Messler's Grow Your Soil to find out what's happening when leaves decay on the soil and why it's important, so important for plants. So we're gonna read this page right here. It's page 110. Is it compost or mulch? So this is going to speak to the issue. So you're going to have to like really think about this and see how it applies. It's not a direct answer. It's an indirect answer. So you got to use your brain, put on your thinking cap. Is it compost or is it mulch? Well, either or both. Basically, mulch is organic matter that sits on top of the soil. And compost is the finished product after you put the same stuff in a pile and help it rot until it looks like dirt and less like stuff. If you leave mulch on top of the soil, it will eventually decompose into compost. You've probably noticed the rich dark layer that develops under pine needles or leaves. That's compost. And it is the pine needles and the leaves. So they are decaying and becoming the compost. Mulch and compost serve similar important functions, improving the soil texture. How important is it to the plant that the soil has a good texture so that its roots can go in there and that it can absorb water? So the texture is super important to the plant. Encouraging microbial life, which is just far more important than we can ever know. I mean, there's a lot of research being done right now, and you think about the human body and how important, and we're discovering how important all of those bacteria and all of everything in our gut is important to our health. The same thing is happening with the trees. So they need this microbial life. And providing food for worms and germs. So there's so many things that are alive in the soil, and all of those things need to be fed, and in turn they're feeding the plant. But how are they getting fed? They're getting fed from those leaves that are dropping on the ground. Think of compost as sort of a sourdough starter. I don't know if you guys use sourdough starters. I love making sourdough, and it's so cool when I use it once a week, and then there's a small amount of the sourdough starter left, and then you put in some flour and you put in some water and you stir it up, and it looks like just really kind of compact down there at the bottom of the jar. And then over the course of the day, it just bubbles up and you see all of these air bubbles. So what's happening is that small amount of yeast, that's the sourdough, is growing and eating all those things. And as it's eating, it's putting out gas, and that's making all the little bubbles, and it just makes it grow. And so then the whole amount has a bunch of yeast all throughout the sourdough. So a healthy mix of worms and germs, and mulch as the flour, so the food for the starter. So in this case, you have the bacteria and the other germs that are in there, the other microbial life. And so that's kind of like the starter. And then you have the leaves that come down, and then that's what they're eating. And so that's like the flour that you're putting into the sourdough starter. Both work together to break up hard, dead dirt clods and then turn them into the kind of rich, crumbly soil that brings tears of joy to the eyes of gardeners and plants, if they had eyes. Both mulch and compost have their charms. Compost is rich in the microbial life that will eventually break down mulch. Mulch protects the compost by keeping the soil surface moist, because all that just like I had to add water to my sourdough, in nature, in the compost with the mulch over it also needs moisture. So the mulch that's on top, the top layer, is keeping that moisture in. The microbes need it, and the plant also needs it. Mulch protects compost by keeping the soil surface moist and hospitable to worms while slowly turning into compost itself. Compost can, of course, be used as mulch, and often this is all you need to do to maintain good soil, because you're feeding the things that are making the soil healthy. As long as it doesn't dry out too much, the good organisms will trickle down. Top dressing with compost once your soil is healthy is often a better idea than digging it in, because digging disturbs the fragile and vital goodness, I hope I'm going to say this correctly. It's basically the fungal parts that are in the soil. Mycorrhiza. Totally messed it up. The fungal, so like basically the mushrooms, when you see the mushrooms, that's like the fruiting part of the mycorrhizae. I'm totally saying that wrong. I'm so sorry. I have said it correctly in the past, but today is not one of those days. So I'm just going to forgive myself, and we're going to move on. But what's amazing about the fungal parts that are in the soil is that they form this, they hold themselves together. So in areas where there's a lot of runoff and a lot of erosion, that can be fixed with fungus. So the fungus creates like this, it's all holding on to each other in the soil, and it's making it it's holding on to all of the soil. So it's providing this amazing structure inside the soil. But when you dig into it, what you're doing is you're cutting all those bonds. So you're actually hurting it, and it will go down. So like if you just put compost on the top instead of digging it in, all of those nutrients will go down into the soil, and they'll feed the microbes, and it will happen. That's how nature actually works. If if you walk outside and you look at a forest, no one's digging it in there. I mean, occasionally you've got some squirrels or something digging into the ground. But the main mechanism that's happening is you just keep getting layers of compost from the leaves with layers of mulch, which is the new leaves. And so it just keeps building up on itself and decomposing and going down into the soil that's below it. So digging, often we think it's like a fast way to get to where we want to go, but sometimes we're actually doing more damage in the process of that action. But keep the compost moist. Cover with mulch and water the surface now and then. So water is really important, and the mulch will help keep it there in the soil. All right, so how do leaves nourish a plant even after they're dead? What are they're doing several things, like they're doing several different jobs there on the soil after they've fallen onto the ground. What are they? All right, in your journal, we have a couple assignments. So collect a variety of leaves from evergreen and deciduous plants. How are they similar or different? So like, what's the texture? What's the thickness? How glossy is the top of the leaf? What do the undersides of the leaf look like? Are the veins of those leaves different? Are the veins in evergreen plants? I feel like a lot of those veins, if you look at them, they're more pronounced and they're almost more protected, right? And then if you look at the deciduous leaves, you can still see all the veins, but it doesn't have that same like rigid structure that a lot of the evergreen plants do. But you got to look at that, feel them for yourself, and see what the differences are. And you can also look at the leaf margins, because remember when we talked about leaves, we talked about all the different ways that they're formed. So the margin is the edge. Look at the shapes of them. Do you think that in general there are evergreens would have a different shape than the deciduous ones? And why would that be? Why would deciduous leaves have maybe a different shape or a different texture to them? And definitely look at, this isn't actually something that we talked about with leaves very much, but feel the top of the leaf and just see what that texture is and why you think that the texture is different that way. Maybe run it under some water or spray some water on it, or just do different things to experiment with that and see what the differences might be. Hold them up to light. Weigh them. So compare them. Examine their size, shape, sheen, and thickness. Record your observations and try pressing the leaves into your journal. So just keep a few in there so that you can refer back to them. You could also do rubbings of them if you don't want to keep the leaves themselves, but make sure that you record all those things like thickness and texture that you probably wouldn't get a chance to see after they're gone. Next is carefully observe a plant when it's putting out new leaves. Ideally, use a plant that you see often so you can draw and record observations of the leaf development. Some plants will have many leaves in different stages of development, so you can examine the entire process at once. So this is something that you can do with both evergreen and deciduous plants. There are the magnolia. Okay, this is my favorite. The new leaves in a magnolia are just so cool. They are different than every other plant I've ever seen. But I haven't seen a lot of other magnolias, so maybe they're all the same way. I'll have to look at the pawpaw this spring and see if they do the same thing, where they are covered by a bract. And most leaves aren't covered by a bract, but the magnolia leaves are covered by a bract, which is just fascinating. So watch them emerge, watch what happens. Is the texture of the leaf different when it first emerges? What does it feel like? What does it look like? How is the green different? Why is the green different? So sometimes you can get a plant that it will have leaves in lots of different stages. So if you look at, for instance, at the magnolia, and you see the new leaves that are still covered in the bract, and then you see the one where the bract was coming off and the leaves are all curled up inside, which is not what they do later. They uncurl, and then if you ever tried to curl them back, you would break them. So then you see the ones that are darker green and they're out and they're very large and very thick and stiff. And then you see the ones that are turning yellow, and what's the texture of those that are turning yellow? Like, are they still really stiff? Are they drying out? Like how easy is it to crumple one of the really green ones, and how easy is it to crumple one of the yellow ones, and how easy is it to crumple one of the ones that's laying on the ground. So watch these different stages, and if you can do them all at once, great. If not, kind of watch them over time and see what happens to them. And you can do that with really any kind of plant. I have the Swiss cheese plant in our house, and it's like constantly putting out new leaves, which is really cool. And even this ivy, here you go. Here's this new little leaf that's coming out. So just any plant that you have that you can watch as the leaves develop, and then as they die, see what happens, the whole process. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining me. I will see you next time. Bye.